Not only is the image inseparable from a before and an after which belong to it, which are not to be confused with the preceding and subsequent images, but in addition it itself tips over into a past and a future of which the present is now only an extreme limit, which is never given. Take for example the depth of field in Wells. When Kane is going to catch up with his friend, the journalist, for the break, it is in time that he moves. He occupies a place in time rather than changing place in space. And when the investigator at the beginning of Mr. Arkadian emerges into the great courtyard, he literally emerges from time rather than coming from another place. Take Visconti's tracking shots. At the beginning of Sandra, when the heroine returns to the house where she was born and stops to buy the black headscarf that she will cover her head with, and the cake that she will eat like magic food, she does not cover space, she sinks into time. And in a film a few minutes long, Appunti su un fatto di cronaca, a slow tracking shot follows the empty path of the raped and murdered schoolgirl, and comes back to the fully present image to load it with a petrified perfect tense, as well as with an inescapable future perfect. In Resnais, too, it is time that we plunge into, not at the mercy of a psychological memory that would give us only an indirect representation, nor at the mercy of a recollection image that would refer us back to a former present, but following a deeper memory, a memory of the world directly exploring time, reaching in the past which conceals itself from memory. How feeble the feedback seems besides explorations of time as powerful as this, such as a silent walk on the thick hotel carpet which each time puts the image into the past in Last Year in Marienbad. The tracking shot of Resnais and Visconti and Wells' depth of field carries out a temporalization of the image or form, a direct time image, which realizes the principle. The cinematographic image is in the present only in bad films. Rather than a physical movement, it is a question above all of a displacement in time. End quote. And undoubtedly there are many possible ways of proceeding. It is, on the contrary, the crushing of depth and the plenitude of the image, which, in Dreyer and other authors, will directly open the image onto time as fourth dimension. But this, as we shall see, because there are varieties of the time image just as there were types of the movement image. But the direct image always gives us access to that Proustian dimension where people and things occupy a place in time which is incommensurable with the one they have in space. Proust indeed speaks in terms of cinema, time mounting its magic lantern on bodies and making the shots coexist in depth. It is this build-up, this emancipation of time, which ensures the rule of impossible continuity and aberrant movement. The postulate of the image in the present is one of the most destructive for any understanding of cinema. But were these characteristics not clear in the cinema at an early stage? Eisenstein? Epstein? Is Schaeffer's theme not valid for the whole of the cinema? How are we to delineate a modern cinema which would be distinct from classical cinema or from the indirect representation of time? We might once more rely on an analogy in thought. If it is true that aberrations of movement were recognized at an early stage, they were, in some sense, corrected, normalized, elevated, and brought into line with laws which saved movement, extensive movement of the world or intensive movement of the soul, and which maintained the subordination of time. In fact, we will have to wait for Kant to carry out the great reversal. Aberrant movement became the most everyday kind, everydayness itself, and it is no longer time that depends on movement, but the opposite. A similar story appears in cinema. For a long time, aberrations of movement were recognized but warded off. The intervals of movement first called its communication into question and introduced a gap or disproportion between a received movement and an executed one. Even so, related to such an interval, the movement image finds in it the principle of its differentiation into the perception image, received movement, and the action image, executed movement. What was aberration in relation to the movement image cases to be so in relation to these two images? The interval itself now plays the role of center, and the sensory motor schema restores the lost proportion, reestablishes it in a new mode between perception and action. The sensory motor schema moves forward by selection and coordination. Perception is organized in obstacles and distances to be crossed, while action invents the means to cross and surmount them, in a space which sometimes constitutes an encompasser, sometimes a line of the universe. Movement is saved by becoming relative. And this status, of course, does not exhaust the movement image. As soon as it stops being related to an interval as sensory motor center, movement finds its absolute quality again, and every image reacts with every other one, on all their sides and in all their parts. This is the regime of universal variation, which goes beyond the human limits of the sensory motor schema towards a non-human world where movement equals matter, or else in the direction of a superhuman world which speaks for a new spirit. It is here that the movement image attains the sublime, like the absolute condition of movement, whether in the material sublime of Vertov, in the mathematical sublime of Gans, or in the dynamic sublime of Murnau or Lang. But in any event, the movement image remains primary and gives rise only indirectly to a representation of time, through the intermediary of montage as organic composition of relative movement, or superorganic recomposition of absolute movement. Even Vertov, when he carries perception over into matter, and action into universal interaction, Peopling the universe with microintervals points to a negative of time as the ultimate product of the movement image through montage.